Ambassador Kethvaris had spent 40 years traveling between stars, and she believed nothing could surprise her anymore. She had walked the crystal halls of the Harmonic Collective where ships sang to each other across the void, and she had stood inside the living vessels of the Thrin Dominion, where walls breathed and floors pulsed with organic warmth. And she had toured the ancient battle stations of the Morix, empire that had guarded their borders for 10,000 years. She considered herself an expert on spacecraft and on the species that built them, so when the newly discovered humans invited the Galactic Council to observe what they called their modest defensive capabilities, she expected very little, and she told herself she would be polite about it. Humanity was young, and everyone knew this, and their first contact with galactic civilization had happened barely 3 standard cycles ago, and before that, they had been alone on their small blue world, fighting among themselves and slowly reaching toward their nearest planets with primitive chemical rockets. How could such a young species possibly impress ambassadors who had seen everything the galaxy had to offer? The diplomatic cruiser Whispered Truth carried 12 ambassadors from 12 different species, and it waited at the edge of the human home system in the cold darkness beyond their outer planets. Kethvaris stood near the main viewport with her forearms folded across her chest and her secondary eyes scanning the empty space ahead, and her chromatophores showing the pale blue of patient boredom. Ambassador Morix of the Sketh Consortium floated beside her in his environmental bubble, and his translator clicked softly as he spoke. They are probably going to show us some converted cargo ship with weapons bolted onto the hull, and we will have to pretend to be impressed and thank them for their hospitality. Kethvaris let her chromatophores shift to the green of agreement, and she wondered how long this demonstration would take and whether the humans would serve acceptable food afterward. Ambassador Thrinka drifted closer on her anti-gravity platform, and her massive bulk cast a shadow across the viewport, and her feeding tendrils curled with what might have been amusement or contempt. I have studied their transmissions and their history, and they are a violent species, and they spent most of their existence fighting each other over resources and territory and ideology, and they nearly destroyed themselves several times before they reached space. That is concerning, said Morix. Thrinka made a wet sound that her translator rendered as laughter. It is pathetic, and they wasted centuries on internal conflict while we were building empires, and they are children playing at being adults, and I expect their warship will reflect this. A human liaison officer stood quietly near the back of the observation deck, and she had introduced herself as Commander Sarah Chan. And she had dark hair pulled back from her face and calm, steady eyes that watched everything without reacting to anything. She had listened to the ambassadors talk about her species for the past hour, and she had said nothing, and her expression had not changed. Now she stepped forward, and the ambassadors turned to look at her. The unconquered sun will arrive in approximately 90 seconds, she said, and her voice was soft, but it carried clearly across the room, and I recommend you remain seated. Kethvaris felt her secondary heart beat a little faster, and she did not know why, because there was nothing threatening about this small human woman, and there was nothing in the empty space ahead except stars and darkness. But something in Commander Chan's voice made her nervous, and something in those steady eyes suggested that the human knew things the ambassadors did not. Morix clicked his amusement, and his translator converted it to words. 90 seconds of warning seems excessive. And what are we supposed to do? And hold on to something that will be wise, said Commander Chen. She was not joking, and Kethvaris realized this with a sudden cold clarity that spread through her body like ice water. The other ambassadors noticed too, and the casual chatter died away, and 12 different species turned to face the viewport with 12 different expressions of uncertainty. Kethvaris counted the seconds in her head, and she reached 60, and nothing happened, and she began to think this was some kind of strange human humor. Then the proximity alarms began to scream every warning system on the Whispered truth activated at once, and red lights flashed, and automated voices shouted in a dozen languages, and the ship's AI declared emergency protocols and urged all passengers to brace for impact. But there was nothing on the sensors, and the space ahead was empty, and Kethvaris could not understand what was happening. Commander Chun stood perfectly still, and she watched the viewport with an expression that might have been pride, and then space broke open. There was no other way to describe it, and Kethvaris would spend years trying to find better words, and she would never succeed. A wound appeared in the fabric of reality itself, and it burned with light that should not exist, and it spread across the darkness like a crack in black glass, and through that impossible tear came something that made every ambassador on the observation deck stop breathing. The ship that emerged was not a ship, and it was a monster, and it was a mountain, and it was a nightmare made of metal and fury. It was black, and it was massive, and it was covered in armor plating so thick that Kethvaris could see the individual panels even from this distance, and those panels were scarred and pitted as if the ship had flown through the heart of a dying star and survived. Weapons bristled from every surface, and there were so many of them, and they were so large, and Kethvaris could not count them because her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The ship kept coming through the wound in space, and it kept coming. And it did not stop, and Kethvaris realized with growing horror that she had misjudged the scale completely. This was not a warship the size of their diplomatic cruiser, and this was not a warship the size of a thring carrier, and this was something else entirely, and it blocked out the stars behind it. Like an eclipse, Ambassador Morix made a sound his translator could not convert, and he pressed himself against the back of his environmental bubble as if trying to get as far from the viewport as possible. Ambassador Thrinka, who had conquered 3 star systems and commanded fleets of thousands, let out a low moan of primal fear, and Commander Sarah Chun smiled very slightly, and she said, "Welcome to humanity's modest defensive capabilities." The unconquered sun hung in the void like a sleeping predator, and it was so large that Kethvaris could not see all of it at once through the viewport. She had to turn her head, and she had to move her eyes, and even then her brain struggled to accept what it was seeing. 12 kilometers long. Commander Chun had said this number casually, as if it meant nothing, and Kethvaris had heard the words, but she had not understood them until now. The largest warship in the Velothian fleet was 2 kilometers long, and it had taken 60 years to build, and it was considered a marvel of engineering and a symbol of their civilization's power. The humans had built something 6 times larger, and they called it modest. Ambassador Morix finally found his voice, and it came out as a series of rapid clicks that his translator struggled to keep up with. The power requirements alone would drain a star, and this is not possible, and you cannot have built this, and our scientists would say this violates fundamental principles of energy conservation. Commander Chun turned to look at him, and her expression was patient, like a teacher explaining something simple to a confused student. Your scientists work with the physics they understand, and we found physics they have not discovered yet. Thrinke moved her massive body forward, and her platform groaned under her weight, and her compound eyes reflected the terrible image of the human warship. "What do you mean you found new physics?" "We had to," said Chun, and her voice was calm and steady, and she spoke as if she were discussing the weather rather than reshaping the ambassador's understanding of reality. "And we were alone, and we were afraid, and we needed to protect ourselves. And so we kept looking until we found what we needed, the unconquered." Sun began to turn, and it moved with a grace that something so massive should not possess, and Kethvaris watched its engine sections come into view, and they glowed with a light that hurt to look at directly. Those engines burned with contained power that made the ambassador's diplomatic cruiser look like a child's toy floating next to an ocean beast. Ambassador Wrath of the Crystalline Accord spoke for the first time, and his voice resonated through his silicon-based body like wind through chimes. "I am detecting energy signatures that should not exist, and my sensors are telling This ship is outputting more power than our entire civilization consumes in a standard year, and this must be an error. It is not an error, said Chun, the unconquered. Sun completed its turn, and now its bow faced the diplomatic cruiser, and Kethvaris saw the front of the ship clearly for the first time. It tapered to a point that was reinforced with layers of armor so thick she could see them from here, and that point looked designed to punch through anything that got in its way, and she realized with sick certainty that this ship was built to ram through other vessels and keep going. But what caught her attention and held it was the writing on the hull, painted in letters so large that each one was taller than her entire diplomatic cruiser, were 2 human words. We remember Kethvaris did not know what those words meant, but she felt them in her bones, and they carried a weight that pressed against her chest and made her secondary hearts beat faster. Remember what she heard herself ask. Everything said, Commander Chung, and her eyes went distant for a moment, and shadows moved behind them like ghosts, and then she was back and present and professional again. The ambassadors stood in silence, and they stared at the impossible ship, and none of them knew what to say. Morix eventually spoke again, and his clicks were slower now and more careful. You said this was a defensive capability, and defense against what? And who could possibly threaten you? And why would you need something like this? Chun did not answer immediately, and she looked at each ambassador in turn, and her gaze was measuring and thoughtful. We spent a very long time hurting each other, she said finally, and we got very good at it, and we learned things about violence and survival that we wish we did not know. And when we finally stopped fighting among ourselves, we looked up at the stars, and we saw how big the universe was, and we saw how small we were, and we asked ourselves a question. What question? Said Kethvaris. What if someone out there is as good at violence as we are? The words hung in the air like a blade, and Kethvaris felt cold spread through her body because she understood now. The humans had not built this ship to conquer, and they had not built it to threaten, and they had built it because they were afraid. They were afraid because they knew exactly what a species could do when it decided to be cruel, and they knew because they had done it to themselves over and over again. Throughout their history, they had climbed out of their own darkness, and they had looked at the galaxy, and they had wondered if that darkness existed elsewhere too. And so they had built the unconquered sun, not as a weapon of aggression, but as a promise that whatever darkness existed in the universe would find humanity ready and waiting and unwilling to be victims. Commander Chun watched the ambassadors process this, and her expression softened slightly. We would like to invite you aboard, she said, and Admiral Webb is waiting to give you a tour, and I think you will find it educational. Kethvaris looked at the massive ship, and she looked at the small human woman, and she understood that she was about to learn things that would change everything. She believed about the galaxy. She was terrified, and she could not wait. Lead the way, she said. The shuttle that carried the ambassadors to the unconquered sun was small and fast, and it flew through the shadow of the warship for what felt like an eternity. Kethvaris pressed her face to the window, and she watched the hull slide past, and she saw details that made her stomach twist with fear. Gun batteries, the size of Velothian destroyers, lined the ship's flanks in neat rows, and each one could probably destroy the diplomatic cruiser with a single shot, and there were hundreds of them. Point defense turrets clustered around vital sections like protective scales, and they tracked the shuttle as it approached, and Kethvaris knew they could tear her into atoms before she even registered the light. Missile tubes ran in long, vertical columns, and each tube was large enough to launch warheads, bigger than her personal transport, and she counted the tubes and lost track somewhere past 300. This is what fear looks like when it builds a body, Trinka said quietly, and her voice carried a respect that Kethvaris had never heard from her before. The shuttle docked in a hangar bay that could have held a small fleet, and human technicians moved around them with calm efficiency, and none of them seemed impressed. by the ambassadors, all worried about their opinions. Admiral Marcus Webb waited for them on the hangar deck, and he was a tall man with gray hair and lines on his face that spoke of years and decisions and burdens carried. He smiled as the ambassadors emerged, and his smile was warm and genuine, and Kethferus did not know what to make of that. "Welcome aboard," he said, and his voice was deep and steady, and it echoed slightly in the vast space around them. "And I am honored to show you what humanity has built." He led them through corridors that hummed with power and walls that displayed screens showing system readouts and crew manifests and duty rosters. Kethferus tried to count the crew members they passed, and she gave up when she reached 500, because they were everywhere, and they all seemed busy and purposeful. 3,000 people live aboard this ship," said Admiral Webb, as if reading her thoughts, "and they work in shifts to keep everything running, and they train constantly. And they maintain our systems, and they raise their families." Kethferus stopped walking, and she stared at him. "Families," she repeated. Webb nodded, and he gestured for them to follow, and he led them through a section of the ship that looked completely different from the military corridors they had been walking. There were colors here, and there were plants growing under artificial lights, and there were children. Human children ran through open spaces, and they laughed, and they played games, and they paid no attention to the alien ambassadors staring at them with expressions of complete confusion. "A school," said Webb, and he pointed to a room where young humans sat at desks and looked at screens and listened to a teacher explain mathematics. "And we have 3 schools aboard for different age groups." Marx clicked rapidly, and his translator worked overtime. "You bring children onto a warship, and this is the most powerful weapon in your arsenal, and you fill it with younglings." Webb stopped walking, and he turned to face the ambassadors, and his expression was serious now. "This ship may be the most powerful weapon humanity has ever built," he said carefully, but it is also a home, and it is a community, and it carries our future as well as our firepower, and we will not sacrifice who we are in order to protect what we have." He resumed walking, and the ambassadors followed in stunned silence. They passed through hydroponics bays where food grew in carefully maintained rows, and they passed through recreation areas where off-duty crew played sports and watched entertainment, and they passed through medical facilities that could handle any emergency. And then Webb led them to a different kind of room. The memorial hall stretched the length of a city block, and its walls were covered with names, and the names went on forever in every direction, carved into dark stone that seemed to absorb the light. Kethferus walked slowly along the wall, and she read names she could not pronounce and dates she did not understand, and she felt something heavy settle in her chest. "What is this place?" she asked. "These are our dead," said Webb, and his voice was quiet now, and heavy with something she recognized as grief, even across species lines. "And these are the humans who died in our wars and our conflicts and our mistakes, and we carry them with us wherever we go." There were millions of names, and Kethferus understood that now, and she understood that each name represented a life ended by violence. "You killed each other," she said, and it was not a question for a very long time, said Webb, "and for very bad reasons, and for no reasons at all, and we learned things about ourselves that we wish we could forget, and we built weapons that could have ended everything, and we came so close to destroying ourselves that we could taste the ashes. But you did not destroy yourselves," said Thrinka, and she floated forward to examine the names more closely. "And you survived," Webb nodded. "Slowly we survived, because we finally decided that we wanted to live more than we wanted to win, and we looked at what we had done, and we were ashamed, and we swore we would never do it again, and we built this ship to make sure we never had to." He placed his hand on the wall, and his fingers touched names that must have meant something to him personally. "We carry our dead because they remind us what we are capable of," he said, "and they remind us why we must never become that again. And they remind us that power without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen." Kethferus looked at the Admiral, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen in a warrior before. She saw humility, she saw regret, and she saw determination. That burned like the engines that powered this impossible ship. "You built the greatest weapon in the galaxy," she said slowly, as understanding dawned in her mind, "and you built it to make sure you never have to use it." Webb smiled sadly. "We built it because we know exactly what happens when species decide to be monsters," he said. "And we have been monsters, and we never want to be monsters again. And so we built something that can stop monsters, and we pray every day that we never need it." The observation deck on the unconquered sun was larger than most auditoriums, and it offered a view of space that made Kethferus feel very small and very fragile. The ambassadors gathered near the massive windows, and they watched as human crew members prepared for what Admiral Webb called a routine demonstration of defensive capabilities. An asteroid field drifted in the distance, and the rocks ranged in size from pebbles to mountains, and they tumbled slowly in the darkness like sleeping giants. "We will begin with primary weapons," said Webb, and he stood in a command console, and his officers moved around him with practiced efficiency. "And please observe the targeting accuracy." Kethferus did not know what to expect, and she told herself she was prepared for anything after what she had already seen. She was wrong. The main batteries fired. There was no sound in space, but she felt the vibration through the deck plates, and she saw the light, and the light was terrible and beautiful. And it streaked across the void faster than her eyes could follow. The largest asteroid in the field simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, and it was the size of a small moon, and the next moment it was an expanding cloud of dust and debris. And the light of the explosion painted the observation deck in shades of orange and red. Morix made a sound that his translator could not convert, and Kethferus understood it anyway because she felt the same thing. "That was a single volley," said Webb calmly, "and we can sustain that rate of fire for approximately 6 hours before requiring reactor cooling." 6 hours, repeated Thrinka, and her voice was hollow and strange. "And you could destroy an entire fleet in 6 hours. We could destroy several fleets," said Webb, and there was no pride in his voice and only fact. "And we have run the simulations." The guns fired again and again, and each time an asteroid vanished, and the precision was surgical and mechanical and absolutely terrifying. Kethferus watched a rock the size of her species capital building get reduced to particles, and she watched another the size of a city get split in half by twin beams of energy, and she watched the humans around her perform these acts of destruction with the same casual competence as technicians running maintenance checks. Then Commander Chun stepped forward, and she spoke to the weapons officers, and something changed in the atmosphere. "We will now demonstrate point defense capability," she announced, and Admiral Webb has approved the release of target drones. A hatch opened somewhere on the unconquered sun, and small objects poured into space like seeds scattered from a hand. Kethferus counted them automatically, and she reached 1,000 and then 2,000, and then she lost track because there were so many and they moved so fast. 10,000 drones," said Chun, "and they are programmed to simulate a mass missile attack, and they will attempt to reach this ship from all directions simultaneously." Morix leaned forward, and his environmental bubble pressed against the window. 10,000 is too many," he said with something like relief in his voice. "And no point defense system can track that many targets, and even the unconquered sun must have limits, and you will have to let some through." Chun looked at him, and her expression was patient. "Watch," she said. The drones swarmed toward the ship, and they came from every angle, and they moved in unpredictable patterns designed to confuse tracking systems, and they accelerated to speeds that made them almost invisible against the stars. The unconquered sun's point defense network activated. Kethferus had seen point defense systems before, and she knew how they worked, and she knew their limitations, and she knew that every system had a saturation threshold beyond which it could not function effectively. The human system did not seem to care about thresholds. Turrets swiveled and fired and swiveled and fired, and the space around the ship became a web of light as thousands of weapons engaged thousands of targets simultaneously. Each turret seemed to know exactly where every drone was and exactly where every other turret was shooting, and they coordinated with a precision that should have been impossible. 4.7 seconds said. Chunwen was over and 10,000 targets eliminated and 0 breaches of defensive perimeter. Ambassadors stared at the empty space where 10,000 drones had been moments before. How whispered. Ketferis, and her voice felt weak and small in her throat. Quantum-linked targeting arrays, said Chun, and each turret shares information with every other turret instantaneously, and there is no communication delay and there is no calculation time, and they operate as one system with 10,000 components. Ambassador Vreth's crystalline body rang with what might have been distress. This violates everything we understand about information theory, he said, and you cannot transmit data faster than light, and our physicists have proven this. Chun smiled slightly. Your physicists work with the rules they have discovered, and we needed rules they had not found yet, and so we kept looking. Ketferis thought about her people's military, and she thought about their proud fleet, and their advanced weapons, and their centuries of technological development, and she realized that none of it mattered if humanity decided to make war against the Velothian Concordat. The conflict would last approximately one afternoon, and her entire civilization would become a footnote in human history books. This is not a warship, she said, and her chromatophores flickered through colors she could not control, and this is not a weapon, and I do not know what this is, Admiral. Webb walked over to stand beside her, and his presence was calm and solid, and somehow comforting despite everything. This is a choice, he said quietly, and every day we wake up and we choose what to do with this power, and we could conquer, and we could destroy, and we could take whatever we wanted from whoever we wanted, and no one could stop us. Then, why do you not do these things? Asked Trinka, and her voice held genuine curiosity rather than fear. Now Webb looked out at the stars, and his expression was thoughtful. Because we remember what it felt like to be conquered, he said, and we remember what it felt like to be destroyed, and we remember what it felt like to have things taken from us, and we will not become the thing we feared. He turned to face the ambassadors, and his eyes held that strange combination of humility and strength that Ketferis was beginning to associate with humanity. We are not good because we are weak, he said, and we are good because we are strong enough to afford it. The ambassadors returned to the whispered truth in silence, and the shuttle ride felt longer than before, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. Ketferis sat by the window, and she watched the unconquered sun shrink behind them, and even at this distance it dominated the view, and even growing smaller it seemed to fill the universe with its presence. The diplomatic cruiser's conference room felt different now, and the walls that had seemed solid and safe now seemed thin and fragile, and every ambassador knew that the ship they stood in could be destroyed in a heartbeat by the weapon they had just toured. They gathered around the central table, and they looked at each other, and they waited. Finally, it was Thrinka who broke the silence. And this surprised Ketferis because the Thrinn were not known for speaking first. I have conquered 3-star systems, she said, and her voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. And I have commanded fleets that burned worlds. And I have done terrible things in the name of power, and I thought I understood strength. She paused, and her feeding tendrils curled inward in a gesture Ketferis had never seen before. I understood nothing, she continued, and I was a child playing with fire, and I thought I was a god. And the humans have shown me what real power looks like. Morix clicked slowly, and his translator rendered his words carefully. They could destroy us, he said, and they could destroy all of us and every species in this room and every species we know, and there is nothing we could do to stop them. Ambassador Vreth's crystalline form pulsed with nervous light. Then we are at their mercy, he said, and we must accept whatever terms they offer, and we have no choice. No, said Kethvaris, and she spoke before she realized she was going to speak, and every eye in the room turned toward her. No, she repeated. And we are not at their mercy, and they have chosen not to show us mercy, and they have shown us something else entirely, explained, demanded Thrinka. Kethvaris stood, and she walked to the viewport, and she looked out at the stars, and she gathered her thoughts. When my people were young, she said slowly, and we feared everything, and we feared the darkness, and we feared the cold, and we feared each other, and we built walls, and we built weapons, and we conquered our neighbors because we were afraid they would conquer us first. She turned to face the other ambassadors. The humans were the same, she said, and they feared, and they fought, and they nearly destroyed themselves, and their memorial hall holds millions of names because they were so afraid that they killed each other over and over again. We know this, said Morix impatiently, and they told us their history and what is your point. My point, said Kethvaris, and she let her chromatophores shift to the deep purple of profound realization, and is that they stopped. The room fell silent. They stopped. She repeated, and they looked at what they had done, and they were ashamed, and they decided to be different, and they built the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, not to use it, but to make sure they never had to. She walked around the table, and she looked at each ambassador in turn. They could have come to us as conquerors, she said, and they could have demanded tribute, and they could have made us kneel, and we would have had no choice but to obey. But they did not do that, she continued, and they came to us as equals, and they invited us to tour their ship, and they showed us their schools and their gardens and their memorials, and they told us their shameful history without hiding anything. Why, asked Vreth, and his voice was small and confused. Because they are waiting, said Kethvaris, and understanding filled her like light filling a dark room, and they are waiting to see what we will do. She pointed out the viewport toward the distant shape of the unconquered sun. They have shown us who they were and who they became, and they have shown us that change is possible, and they have shown us that a species can crawl out of the darkness and become something better. Now they want to see if we can do the same. Thrinka was quiet for a long moment, and her massive body was still, and her compound eyes reflected the starlight. I have conquered 3 systems, she said again, and I did it because I believed the strong should rule the weak, and I believed this was the natural order, and I believed it was right. She made a sound that her translator rendered as a sigh. The humans are stronger than I will ever be, and they do not rule, and they do not conquer, and they choose to be kind, even though they can afford to be cruel. What does that make me, she asked, and her voice held genuine anguish. Kethvaris walked over to the Thrin ambassador, and she placed one of her 4 hands on the massive creature's side. It makes you someone who has the chance to choose again, she said softly, and it makes you someone who can look at what you have done and decide to be different. She looked around the room at the gathered ambassadors, and she saw fear and confusion and shame, and she saw something else too. She saw hope. The humans have not threatened us, she said, and they have not demanded anything from us, and they have simply shown us what is possible and what is right, and they are waiting to see what we will do with that knowledge, ambassador. Morix clicked thoughtfully. You are saying they want us to be better. I'm saying they believe we can be better, said Kethvaris, and they believe this because they were worse than any of us, and they changed, and if they can change, then anyone can change. Returned to her seat, and she folded her 4 arms, and she let her chromatophores shift to the warm goal of determination. The question is not whether the humans will destroy us, she said, and the question is whether we will become the kind of civilizations that deserve to stand beside them. The ambassadors looked at each other, and Cathverus saw decisions being made behind alien eyes, and she saw old assumptions crumbling, and she saw new possibilities taking root somewhere in the distance. The unconquered sun hung in the darkness like a promise, and like a warning, and like proof that even monsters could become guardians. And 12 species began the long, slow work of choosing who they wanted to be. The end.